So everyone, here we are. It's my great honor to be in attendance at one of the strangest conferences I've ever been invited to. I think this is the actual definition of being on the edge of the abyss. Literally no one knows what we're doing here. So the people who are up here on the stage all represent a field of science and inquiry and exploration that for many, many thousands of years was relegated to the world of religion and healing, cultural connection and community. And each of them in their own way has taken huge risks to bring psychedelic medicines into the modern world, into a medical framework, and even into our modern communities. They are intelligent, they're leaders, they're risk takers, they love adventure, and most importantly, they love drugs. I'm sure that some of those descriptions apply to those of you in the audience. But more than just loving drugs, we also love being able to give drugs to other people in ways that can benefit them. From vines to cacti, mushrooms, chemicals that were conjured in laboratories, and even toads. Psychedelic medicines are yielding impressive results in the fields of psychiatry and healing. And one of the most striking things is that even though we don't understand how these medicines really work, the point is that they are working. And they're working so well that it's challenging the medical community to pay attention. It's challenging the public to pay attention. The way that psychiatry developed and kind of differentiated itself from the rest of medicine was it sought to create a biological connection between healing and the mind. But one of the downfalls, or the kind of blind spots of psychiatry, is that they started to just focus on molecules and chemicals that either barely work or don't work at all. They treat individuals in isolation and then send them back into communities that don't understand how they were sick to begin with or how they have gotten better. The psychedelic framework represents a holistic, integrated, spiritual, and challenging paradigm. It is both a process of destruction and creation, of death and rebirth, that at times can look very messy and scary and unpredictable. While normal therapy even takes months, years to start working, psychedelics can work overnight. This is exciting, but it's also very scary for the establishment. To quote a major scientist who came to speak at Johns Hopkins while I was working there, "I wonder how fast we would cure cancer if our careers didn't depend on researching cancer." Right now we're facing three major obstacles in the development of psychedelics as modern medicine. The first is legality. The second is a lack of public funding and recognition by government agencies, and also general skepticism and fear within the medical community and within the public. And today we'll explore these issues and try to inspire those of you in the audience to join us in this courageous endeavor to not combatively push psychedelics into our culture, but to create the conditions and context in which the public, the government, the medical community feels like this is something they want and have needed their whole life, and are so happy we've arrived. So up here with me, I have Alan Davis, a clinical psychologist and research fellow at Johns Hopkins, working with Roland Griffiths and his team studying psilocybin and other drugs. I have Sara Gael, transpersonal psychotherapist in Boulder, Colorado. She was on the groundbreaking phase 2 study of MDMA for PTSD, and she'll be on the phase 3 trial that's upcoming, MAP sponsored. She also is the director of the Zendo Project, which goes right to the heart of the festival culture at Burning Man, Africa Burn, and festivals all over the world, helping people in the most difficult situations make the most of their psychedelic experiences. And she's also working on ketamine-assisted psychotherapy in Boulder now. We also have Dennis McKenna. An enthopharmacologist with nearly 30 years of experience studying Amazonian psychedelics, primarily ayahuasca. He was a founding member of the Hefter Research Institute, which has done probably the most of any nonprofit organization to advance the study of psilocybin in a modern medical context. We have Joe Tafur, an integrative family physician and ayahuascero trained in the Shipibo tradition. He has a new book that has just come out recently, The Fellowship of the River. And he's a co-founder of Modern Spirit, a nonprofit demonstrating the value of spiritual healing in modern healthcare. And finally, we have Neşe Devenot, who's a postdoctoral fellow in digital humanities at the University of Puget Sound. And she studies how metaphor and literary devices function in verbal descriptions of the psychedelic experience. And my name is Katherine MacLean. I worked at Johns Hopkins doing psilocybin research for 4 years until I learned that life had a different plan for me. And I now do integration work with individuals in New York City. I live on a farm, and I help people have legal mushroom experiences in Jamaica. So we have a whopping 47 minutes to cover all of the territory that will be interesting to you all. To start, I'd love for the panelists to take us into their world and help us through a personal story of someone's life that they saw change in a transformative way, or something that really inspired them in their research and clinical practice.
Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. There's a lot of beautiful and transformative stories that come to mind with this question, and I think about a lot of people who I've seen benefit from the application of these medicines and the use of them in clinical contexts. And at the same time, the thing that is most recently standing out to me as a transformative experience is maybe one that isn't as beautiful right now, which is a young person recently contacted me by email and to reach out and to seek help because someone had recently come into their community delivering a very powerful psychedelic medicine without a lot of training and without a lot of help for people's preparation and integration. And this young person is now struggling with debilitating panic and without a supportive community to really help them make sense of what they've experienced and more importantly have support in seeking out continued meaning making from that experience. And so coming into my world right now is a beautiful one, and it's also one where I feel a little bit as though, how do I protect individuals if possible? I think that that's largely going to be through science, that I'm biased, that's my passion, but I also think as communities and as a culture, we need to start recognizing when the use of these medicines is something that is actually causing harm or has the potential to cause harm without the right kinds of supportive community environments. And so, yeah, it's transformation in a way that hopefully will continue, and this person will hopefully continue their healing, but that's something that I'm reconciling with myself right now, is how to best see that process unfold for this work.
So I feel like I've been gifted with a unique opportunity to work in both worlds of research and in the recreational arena with the Zendo Project. And I've seen literally hundreds, we've helped over 3,000 people in the Zendo Project at festivals since 2012. And I've seen the lives of many of the people who come into that space transform. They share stories about what their experience in the Zendo provided them. They come out sharing that they have a different relationship with psychedelics and with drugs than when they ended up in the space, and that they have more of a respect and desire more of an intentional relationship with psychedelic medicines. And as part of the MDMA research, I was able to sit with people for 3 MDMA sessions throughout the course of about 4 months and see the transformations that these people who had been struggling with PTSD, treatment-resistant PTSD, for an average of 19 years. Is my mic still on? For an average of 19 years, to see them transform in a matter of months, to see the light come back into their eyes, for their relationships to shift and change, for them to be able to be there for their families, for their children. And that that work has given me just so much hope for MDMA, for PTSD treatment in particular. And I know that the many other medicines that are out there that I'm not working with myself, just seeing the transformations in both recreational settings as well as in clinical settings that people have gone through is what keeps me connected and passionate to this work when obstacles come up and when it can be challenging at times. So yeah, it's been quite a ride.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Thank you to all the fine people at Symposium for arranging this. It's a pleasure to be here, even if it is 120 degrees in the sun. I remind myself that back where I live, it's -6 right now. So, you know, I'm grateful to be here and not there. As most of you know, I've been involved with psychedelic research and, you know, for well over 35 years. Originally mushrooms, but I did my PhD work on ayahuasca, and that was in 1981. And that was the beginning of an adventure that continues. For me, ayahuasca has been extremely good to me, and both as a avenue of professional investigation and fascination, and also as a spiritual pursuit, on the personal level. I've had so many emails and so many people tell me from their ayahuasca experiences, ayahuasca changed my life. Usually they mean that for the better. And I would have to say it certainly has changed my life. I'm grateful for being blessed with the opportunity to bring the medicine to people. I don't pour the medicine. I'm not a shaman. But I arrange situations where people can experience the medicine in supportive circumstances with lots of opportunity for integration and learning. I've been organizing retreats in Peru on a regular basis for the last 5 years, and in those retreats we emphasize creating a context where people can have these experiences, and the emphasis is, it applies to ayahuasca or any psychedelics, the real learning, the real teaching goes on between you and the medicine. You know, the medicine is the teacher, not the shaman, not the psychotherapist, not the guru. In fact, I think that whole guru shtick is kind of out of place in the psychedelic world. Those people can facilitate your experience. Ultimately, it's up to you to have the experience yourself. No one can have it for you, and then to make of it what you will, with, you know, advice from other people. But we very much emphasize that we're not here to tell you what you're supposed to experience. The interaction between you and the medicine will create that. So, I mean, I could go on, I'm sure, but I think what's interesting now is that ayahuasca, now that it's going global, it's emerging out of these indigenous traditions, and they are becoming transformed, sometimes not in good ways, but often in good ways. I try to look at it from an evolutionary or co-evolutionary perspective. Ayahuasca is not the property of anyone, no indigenous group or anyone else. It's the common heritage of humanity. And I really think the reason ayahuasca has moved out of its indigenous context, out of the Amazon now, is that it is kind of an ambassador from Gaia. It's kind of an ambassador from the community of species. And it's trying to get out to people, get its message out. And it's sometimes not too particular how it does that, because remember, it's intelligent, but it's intelligent in the way a plant is, not like the way we are. So part of its agenda is to get out there and make connections, and that's happening. What we as a community have to do is very simple. We have to foster that project, not be too judgmental, try to maximize the benefit that can come from what is really a new symbiosis with the different species on this planet. Try to maximize the benefit from that, and yet not be too judgmental, because nobody really is running this except the plants. And ayahuasca reminds me of that every time. Remember, you're not running this show, we're running the show. The plants are running the show. And that's true of life on Earth, right? Because they're sustaining life on Earth. So any kind of arrogance or attempt to seize control of some of these social situations is misguided. I think the best shaman I know are humble, and they're the ones that say, I'm not a shaman. I just know a few tricks, right?
Thank
and
you,
that
Dennis.
essentially is true. So we'll
Dennis,
have more chance
yes.
to talk about all this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Am I up? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I would just say for my own, what I've observed in transformation, just myself, I had a big healing with peyote. You know, I'm not up here because I love drugs. I'm up here because I'm into healing and plant spirit medicine and ceremony, and that's my interest. And because of the healing that I received from peyote, it got me interested in ayahuasca, and I started going down to Peru, and eventually probably the big case that got me to be very interested as a medical doctor was a family friend who's a Vietnam vet, PTSD, who's looking at 40 years of PTSD from Vietnam, and going to support groups with kids coming back from Iraq and coming back from Afghanistan, and they're looking at him like, wow, I'm going to be in the support group for the next 4 decades. And just to see him transform and heal within, in this particular example, an indigenously based ceremonial context designed around, just like the MDMA assisted psychotherapy, and even the integration that they're doing at Zendo, providing the added support to really maximize the potential benefit. And that guy's life was transformed, came off of psychiatric meds, lifestyle improvements that led to improvements in his diabetes and heart problems and all the rest of it, and got back together with his ex-wife and reconciled with his daughters, et cetera, et cetera.
Wow,
So
amazing.
that was what got me to go one step further, and then eventually, to train to pour myself, and to give it to people, and not to be a shaman, but to learn a few tricks, I guess,
Thank you.
So, my career path was shown to me on an acid vision in 2006 when I knew nothing about psychedelics at all. And the experience, I described it felt like a job offer where I was shown the retirement benefits and various aspects, and I was really enthusiastic about it at the time. And it healed me of really debilitating social anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. It's really changed my life personally. But the thing that's been the most impressive to me is following that vision and going out and being part of this movement, and also the cultural aspect of the movement. So I was part of a team, as like with Daniel Shankin, who's also responsible partially for this event. We put Psychedemia, the Psychedelics conference, together in 2012, and I've done various things since then. And this past year, I've been to 7 countries talking about psychedelics. And at every country I've been to, people have approached me and said how, whether it's seeing Psychedemia or these other kind of talks or events that I've helped put together, has really given them permission to plug in to the community in their own completely unique, special way that has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And so just seeing how people feel drawn to community on the one hand, and also feel compelled to give their own gifts and their own talents to round out the contributions of this movement and making change in the world. So that's been most inspiring to me.
Thank you. So we've also been tasked with the challenge of having a conversation in a semicircle where we're facing all of you. That conversation, casually had, would last probably a week. But we'll try to give you a little bit of glimpse of what it's like in our world, where a lot of us end up having conversations about psychedelics all the time with lots of different types of people. I feel like an interesting kind of launching point might be talking about space and kind of context for healing, because everyone up here on the panel has been in a lot of different types of contexts, from very kind of boring clinical laboratories to the jungle to festivals to these kind of also unpredictable community kind of conference environments. And I'm curious, how many people in the audience, if you could have your perfect psychedelic healing experience, would have it in a medical clinic? Okay. How many of you would have it in a kind of place like this, a ceremonial space, or even if it wasn't ceremonial, somewhere out in nature? Okay. So that's, and then how many people would actually just prefer to stay at home, where they're most comfortable, familiar? Also, you can imagine someone else's home if, you know, you can find a friend who has a kind of sweeter setup than you. So I think, you know, I would love for the panelists to kind of dive into this kind of tricky territory, which is right now we give medicines in medical contexts when it's, you know, surgery or a serious infusion or something that you have to have a doctor or anesthesiologist present. And that's kind of how psychedelics have been envisioned, is that they have to be happening in a very safe, controlled setting for various reasons. Some people actually feel the most comfortable going to a doctor in a clinic to get treatment. So this environment, this audience might be different than that. But also I'd like the panelists to kind of challenge themselves and us to imagine what the future of different contexts for healing might look like. From everything from a clinic to on the street to homes to ceremonial spaces. What do you think is possible?
I could say something. I think that context is important. It's important to have a context where these things can be happening. What kind of context is less important? It can be a psychotherapeutic context in a clinic or in that sort of environment. It can be a shamanic context. It can be even a church, like they use ayahuasca in Brazil, in some of these Brazilian churches, or, you know, the peyote church. The point is that there's a context, there's a structure. And when you're creating a context, what you're doing effectively is you're evoking a sacred space and a sacred time where this can unfold apart from the cares and the concerns of the external world. So primarily you want to be in a safe environment, someplace where you can just open to the experience, and you don't have to worry. There's no threat. You have to be confident that there's no threat. You have to be confident that the people looking after you, be they psychiatrists or shaman, are trustworthy individuals who have your best interests at heart. They're not out to get you. They're not out to, and you know, we know this doesn't always happen. Anytime you have a powerful spiritual technology, which is what these psychedelics amount to, you have people with a lust for power who want to abuse that. We have to really discourage that and denounce it when we see it. I think ultimately, we can't say where this is going, but I think that I'm encouraged that what psychedelics potentially do have is the potential to transform medicine and psychiatry completely and bring shamanism and the best of psychiatry together to create some kind of a new paradigm that incorporates the best elements of both. The psychiatry of the future may look a lot like shamanism, and I think that's a good thing.
Sara, I'm curious, since you've had experience in both extremes, the kind of super clinical context and the completely chaotic festival environment.
That too.
That too. So, what have you seen work in different spaces? Or what are the major drawbacks in both?
Yeah. So with the Zendo Project specifically, it feels like one thing we kind of talk about as a team is that one of our goals is to create a container where there isn't one. So events like Burning Man, which started off as really small events, and that's where the Zendo Project was born. I think that there was some intention in the beginning of like, let's make this a space where people can come together and commune, and part of that way of connecting in communion for some of those people included taking psychedelics. And so as that event grew, I think it became harder to create a container in that space, and it became very clear that there needed to be people who were specifically trained to create that space and a container for people who were having a challenging time, or other people who are having a challenging time because of whatever they were up to. They might be having a great time. but they needed a container of sorts. And so in that container, in the Zendo project, we have a peer support model. So our supervisors and our main staff are mainly clinicians, so some sort of mental health background, but not always. We do have people from various other backgrounds as well as shamanic background. And we train peers, we train people from all different backgrounds and walks of life to provide compassionate care for those in need. So we operate in that peer support model. So not everyone who's working in the Zendo is a clinician. And I think that has worked really well. And the Zendo Projects training, we didn't just create that out of thin air. It has a foundation in years and years of teachings and wisdom that has been carried down through the generations long before psychedelics even came to Western civilization. So our tools that we use in the Zendo are really based in years of teachings of shamanism and mental health and psychedelic research. And we, as well as festival communities, so RockMed, like the beginning of harm reduction services at festival events in the 60s. So that's the information that we share, and we kind of put it together in this comprehensive model, and then we share it with the trainees who work with us. And then those people go out they volunteer with us, and then they go out into the community, into their respective communities with more information and knowledge about how to support people in a psychedelic space, not just a challenging space. So that has been a model for recreational use that we have found to be very successful, and it's being now adopted all over the world at events that we're not attending. So we attend about a dozen events a year, but we have people who contact us from all different parts of the world who say, we've translated your training material into Portuguese, into Czech, into Spanish. So it's really getting out there, and people are starting their own similar initiatives in their communities. And for that, there is a quality control piece of the training really does, similar to the research setting. The conversation really is about how do we train people, who sets the standards, so whether it's a clinic or a recreational setting, who sets the standards for practice, what is the accountability and the ethical standards that the community can all agree upon, what are the values that we hold, that we are, the ethical and the ethical standards that we are holding as a community. And I think that that's a conversation that's really up right now. And both in the research context, in the ceremonial, more shamanic context, as well as in recreational settings. I think it's really important that we develop a sort of board, or not necessarily board, but a community accountability model, because in mainstream psychiatry, even the accountability and licensure model that we have in mainstream psychiatry is broken, is not really working.
It's not fully protecting
It's not
patients.
fully protecting patients. So I think that that's something to keep in mind regardless of the setting.
And I just wanted to add to that as well that even, this is my struggle, is that in the traditional context, in the ceremonial context, there's really very little oversight, and vulnerable individuals who are often women, often individuals who lack power and privilege, not only in this community, but in our culture as a whole, are at risk for being taken advantage of. And so, although I recognize that the medical model is certainly limited, and my hope is that we can find spaces across all different types of contexts that can welcome people in. My fear is that I don't want to increase, the possibility of vulnerable individuals being taken advantage of, and I think that's a real concern right now. I also want to add that I don't know how many people in this group kind of can ever imagine their parents or grandparents seeking out these medicines. I know I've tumbled that around my head a couple times with my family members, wondering that. And for most of them, and for quite a few volunteers that I've seen in the psilocybin trials, these are often individuals who absolutely would not take the risk of going into an unknown country with unknown people and putting themselves through an experience like this. And so for them, the setting of a Western medicalized version of that, I think is likely going to be the most palatable. And we have to start thinking above and beyond what is a good fit for those of us who are in this bubble in our culture, and thinking about how do we start to engage the community around this bubble in a way that can start to create the types of controls that often indigenous cultures did have in place for controlling the ethics of psychedelic medicines. And we don't have that, certainly not in the United States. And that westernized culture will need to start creating these spaces for conversations and spaces for how to hear and listen and support people who decide to seek these medicines out in whatever context that occurs, whether it's a medical hospital or center or in Peru.
So Joe, I'm curious when you hear that, I mean, you've been also in kind of the two different worlds. So can you imagine taking the world of the jungle into modern medicine? Does it fit? What kind of rituals, what kind of training, what kind of context do you think could actually meet the needs of these, parents and grandparents, but also be consistent with, your training as an ayahuascero?
Yeah, I mean, I would just bring up maybe like reflect on a couple points that have been brought up. First is, I mean, it's there's these different approaches, right? And when we talk about the clinical approach and the research approach and what's really underneath that, at least from MAPS, who's very public about this position that a lot of people understand, this is a pathway towards legalization, okay? That's why, at the heart of hearts, a lot of people, that's what they want, okay? They don't want to see people going to prison for this kind of stuff, that the issue around that. And so then also to investigate the clinical benefit and try to learn the most we can about that. So then we look at a situation like Peru where it's legal, ayahuasca is legal. And we can talk about, and it's very real, the concerns about vulnerable people coming from other cultures and being at risk. Unfortunately, that's true right now here tonight in Tulum. Vulnerable women will be taken advantage of with substance, and it's very popular in the United States. So that's almost an independent issue that needs to be addressed. In other words, like across the board. So I think, to me, the most important thing from this discussion, and I think it's going to advance things, coming from a Peruvian kind of environment, like Latin, here we are in Mexico, where everyone is not waiting for the state to tell them about culture. They're not waiting for the state or the institutions to tell them about their family, It's like community and family actually drive culture. So community and family drive culture. Like that's really where it is. And so it is those relationships with your parents and your children that are going to be doing it. And so then in that regard, it's like, in the beauty of this is we have to draw, experience teaches wisdom. And so then we have the Zendo, they're learning over decades and drawing from every route they can draw from to develop what they're doing and sharing what they're doing. At the same time, what's going on in research, MDMA, assisted psychotherapy, etc., decades, stuff, things like Dennis McKenna bringing everything he's bringing to the culture. And then in this case, drawing from indigenous traditions where we do it with the grandparents. We do it with the babies right there. And so there's a lot you can learn from that. So it's like, if you're trying to figure out how to do that, it exists. And so it's about kind of crossing cultural barriers to learn and get as much wisdom as you can. Yes, be aware of the risks, but the risks are real everywhere. You target them, it's like, hey, well, why don't we target somebody else too? So there's all these festivals. You think stuff like that doesn't go on? Thank God for the Zendo Project. So it's just everyone is trying to figure out how to do it. But I think culture and community and family is a big part of that story. So education is a big part of that story over the justice, criminal justice kind of supervising. Oh, you're not doing it right. Let's put Joe in prison. So I don't know. I think that's very real. That it's about these dialogues. It's about these communities that are being developed. Thank you to Symposia and to everybody and to you, for giving us this kind of space to dialogue with these kind of leading, thinkers in different fields.
Yeah. That brings up so many questions in my mind. How do we create more freedom for people rather than less freedom? How do we actually entrust individuals and communities to decide what's best for them?
They need to assume personal responsibility. Mm-hmm. In Peru, when something like that happens, you can't just go and complain. Mm-hmm. They're going to say, you came here, you don't speak the language, you don't know anything about this place, and you drank this crazy thing with this person you never met. They're like, wow, would you do that in your own country? And so it's that kind of naivete. We need to, America is like, we're suffering from this deep naivete about what's going on. It's like everybody wants to do this stuff, but what if the bad things happen? It's like, guess what? Bad things will happen. So we
in
have
clinical
to be ready
context
for that.
too. That
in
was
clinical everywhere.
Actually, it brings up an interesting point. I know I'm the moderator, but I'm going to make a point here that I saw more anxiety, paranoia, fear, and distress in a clinical environment with a synthetic substance than I saw in Jamaica in an outdoor environment in a group of people taking a massive amount of mushrooms. So, could be the vacation effect, in which case we should be sending all of our mental health patients to the tropics when they come back.
But like, they don't all want to go.
Yeah.
I think you make an interesting point. You make an interesting point. What your point is that there need to be standards, there need to be accepted practices, but it's got to be bottom up. It has to originate in the communities. There has to be agreement about that, and getting that bottom up consensus is sometimes difficult. You can't have clinicians necessarily coming to Peru and say, you guys are not running your retreats the right way. You have to get a consensus from everybody who is, pardon the expression, a stakeholder in this in some respect, you know. And then the other point you made that struck me was, I don't know that it's about bringing the jungle into modern medicine. It may be bringing modern medicine into the jungle.
Well, I was going to ask the opposite too, but all of a sudden in my mind that seemed impossible, so I didn't ask it.
I don't think so, though.
Yeah.
I think that this is the potential to, you know, I referred earlier that it might revolutionize psychiatry, but it's possible to, you know, one of the conundrums we face, those of us who are interested in ayahuasca, is it's very hard to get ayahuasca through an FDA clinical protocol. It's just not going to be approved, or it's much more difficult than something like psilocybin, which can be approached as a pure compound. The FDA likes that and all that. But no one really seems to be asking the question of why do we need to play that game? Why don't we bring good clinical practice to Peru, use that as a platform for investigating ayahuasca and some of these other plant medicines?
And we've definitely seen more research along those lines.
Yeah, it's
Go to the place where it's happening in the best model, in one of the better models.
That's right.
Rather than kind of extracting these random variables out of the context and trying to study
Because you
them.
can't really recreate traditional shamanism in a clinic in Baltimore. I mean, you can do very good work, but it's not the same.
Yeah. Neşe, I don't know what you're about to say, but I did want you to address the freedom issue because I know you studied some pretty radical figures who people tend to vilify, but they kind of stood for like radical personal freedom. And so I don't know if that's what you were going to jump in with, but you're the expert on that. So
Yeah, well, two things. To respond to this issue of mixing of worlds, I was really kind of inspired by a thought that was shared with me by Carlos Tanner, who runs the Ayahuasca Foundation in Peru, and he mentioned his mother, I believe, had cancer and went through chemotherapy, and just seeing that process and what that's like in the West. And he suggested, you know, what if we were to take the container of a kind of traditional indigenous Shipibo ceremony and had, instead of mats and buckets around, you had people in chemo, you know, around, and where they have this, you know, sense of purpose and shared experience with other people, because he said the symptoms are very similar. And so what if you could have change something that people are enduring and trying not to think about, and actually giving a ritual container for that where they can make meaning out of it, and maybe even, you know, see how that affects the how much the chemo works. So just like, you know, I thought that was, you know, made me think of that. But in terms of the freedom issue, so I'm interested in kind of relooking at people like Timothy Leary, who, you know, you mentioned the games that we play and what games we decide to play. And I was really inspired by some of his writings where he was a really original thinker, and I think he's been really vilified in a lot of ways, but I think at the same time, there were a lot of people, you know, now and back in the 60s, people who did abuse their power and did, you know, do some unethical things. And I think it's important to have that nuance of being able to say, you know, people make mistakes and we can learn from those mistakes and say they're not right, and still read what they wrote and learn from them and the insights they had. Because you can be like a terrible person in some context and then still have a lot of valuable things to share. So, and just on the issue of freedom, one last point about how I feel. I agree with some other thinkers in the past year. At a lot of conferences, I've seen a call to really connect this movement to other movements for social justice, because there's a lot of overlap in terms of the dominant traditional population or culture imposing a set of standards and expecting other people to conform to what they're doing, what they think is right, and how they make meaning in the world. And so I think by reaching out to underprivileged communities, whether it's to heal intergenerational or racist, trauma in the United States or whatever else, I think that to be an exemplar to the larger, communities in the world, that to actually forge connections and fight for, the united struggle for justice and for for autonomy. I think that would speak well for the community going forward.
Can I just say something about the issue? It's a wonderful issue brought up of power, and one of the things that strikes me is that often, I think, even when we do kind of entertain these ideas of looking beyond perhaps mistakes that people have made and trying to see through that often those opportunities are afforded to people who have the most power and privilege in our society. And the individuals who don't have that kind of power and privilege, it's often just the vilification, and then that is kind of the end of the story. And so at the same time, as we're considering this, how do you not, throw the baby out with the bathwater, fancy metaphor, is also to think about the ways in which there are a variety of voices that have been systematically disenfranchised for many, many, many years. That's obviously not a new issue to this community. It's in the broader culture as well. But it's something that's very clear to me in psychedelic science. I mean, certainly in our Western medicalized version of science, the people at the top who have the most power and privilege I think it's our duty to think about the ways in which there are other voices, there are other important aspects of this community that are not being recognized through the process of traditional research. And what are the ways in which we can actually bring people into that process? There are people who have important questions that need to be answered. There's important ways of examining those questions that our current scientific models don't really fit nicely into. But it's not that we just have to be comfortable in our box. Like, I think we owe it to this movement in particular to reach out and to try to dispel some of that centralized authority.
They're into decentralization.
Well, it's an interesting idea too. This idea of not just power. So it's like we have an idea as human beings, as like clever human beings, what power is, and a lot of us don't actually understand what power is. So we understand how to dominate and corrupt systems and to take advantage, but that's not power. And so I also think about the idea of authority. And so whether you're in a medical context with the top, usually older white male in charge, making most of the decisions at the bottom, at the end of the line, it's this guy making the decisions. A lot of the funders, actually in shamanic cultures, it's more diverse. It's better. There are actually more women represented in these authority positions. But also, can we imagine a different way where, like you're saying with the Zendo Project, it's more horizontal. It's not this like vertical thing where there's this person at the top saying either this is the right way to do it, or I have special access, or I have special training and power, but it's shared among the community. And so in my work with integration, I'm constantly inspiring and asking the community organizers themselves to say, like, what does your community want? I could come in here and do an integration circle, but then I'm going to go back to my home and my community. And so what do you want? And I think we can also ask that about research. It's like, what do the people who want to be healed want? Do they want to treat their depression, or do they want to treat something broader than that? And so it's just kind of some issues that come up around this idea of, like, what are these medicines even for, and what should we be trying to study?
Just a very quick response to that. When I was working with the NYU psilocybin study, qualitative study, we were really amazed to see, although the people who were in the study were enrolled based on having cancer-related anxiety, so many of the people, in terms of telling what their experience was like, it was about actually processing the trauma of their treatment and going through that, and their relationships with their families, and things that the research question itself was not at all about. And the fact that it came up so much, that's why I think there needs to be more qualitative research of listening to people's stories and then using that as to cycle back in, what new research questions can we ask, what kinds of other communities can we bring into this fold, and just keeping an open dialogue so that the numbers by themselves don't become an abstraction and there's tyranny over everything else.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think partly right now bringing psychedelics into medicine is happening under usually these FDA-approved protocols. So they are much more restricted. I mean, they're highly structured, and there's a lot that you can't get away with, or that you couldn't do, like with respect to the psilocybin end-of-life protocols. You know, I think we can all see how much more beneficial that would be if you could get the loved ones of the patient who is dying to also participate in that kind of protocol. That's a big swallow for the FDA. They're not going to do that. But I think that they might. Some
We could
bodhisattva
try.
or somebody takes over the FDA. But I think once these medicines are approved, then you can find off-label uses, and therapists will be able to use them in a much more appropriate context, because they don't have to always answer to the FDA, you know, and get, okay, we want to make this change, this tiny change in the protocol.
So to unpack that, what you're saying, for anyone who's not familiar, the way that it often works is a medicine gets approved through this very expensive, tedious, long process. And then once that medicine is recognized as it can work for this diagnosis in this safe and effective way, then it can be prescribed what's called off-label, which means for other things, other related diagnoses.
Right.
So
Do you think that's possible for things like psilocybin, ayahuasca, MDMA, or do you think that the FDA or the other government powers that be will say, you know, we let you do it for this one thing, but this other stuff seems too far outside?
I think it's about, I mean, this is a very, I don't know, I'm not an expert in the crypto community, but it's a very strategically minded community. So everything that we're thinking about, when they're thinking about decentralizing global economy, I mean, you have to be strategic, you have to be intelligent, you're not just doing things because so-and-so, I mean, there's reason, so they're doing this FDA approved trial because it's gonna crack open the thing.
Right.
No question. Very smart move. It's gonna become a household thing. Oh, my mom's on psilocybin for her thing. Household type, oh, okay, then it's out there. So then, and then they're doing it with MDMA, is already there. Those two are they're on the way. So it's already happening. That's very much on track, it seems. With ayahuasca, like if I want to be strategic as an ayahuasca-minded person, like, and if I'm worried about practicing in the United States, I'm not going to worry about the FDA because it's all these blocks. If I want to do that, I'm going to do research in Peru, in Colombia, in Brazil, but I'm going to go religious. You know, because that's the protection that's been open. That's the UDV thing. Do I think, oh, but I don't think I should be a church. Hey, I'm against starting a church. You know, I'm not thinking like that at all. I'm being strategic. Like, hey, I want to practice this. This is what they're saying. You have an opportunity through a church pathway. So I think it's about that. I think the strategy plays a major role, and of course, you know, the deeper desires of the people and what do they want, but also being effective and where those two things meet is very important.
I just want to add too, I think it's an important point that FDA in the United States puts a lot of restrictions on what can happen once the trial gets started and the way those trials are even designed. But I'm thinking even like several steps before that, as scientists and individuals start to think about what studies are going to be important, that there can be, I think, more of a dialogue between the individuals, between the community. You know, there's great models for this in other disciplines outside of psychiatry, like community-based participatory research, and really connecting with the people who can have a voice in the process of building the kinds of questions that then maybe can be used to translate that into like more of a medical system type of research.
And we're actually seeing this already. So just this week, two of my best friends and colleagues in California started treating long-term survivors of HIV/AIDS in San Francisco with psilocybin. And they did group therapy to prepare people. The sessions were individual, and then group therapy during integration. So they went to this community that had a specific need that didn't fit in a clear diagnostic box. And a community that had come together around the types of things that had already been studied with psilocybin, like existential distress, terminal illness, depression, trauma. And they said, well, what do you need? You know, it's like, how can we use what we can within the FDA system? And, you know, working directly with Hefter and other of the nonprofit groups, figured out a nice compromise, an accommodation that said, well, we're not going to give a whole group of people psilocybin at once because that's one step kind of too far beyond the comfort zone of what we've established, but it's closer. And you're seeing that, I think, more and more. The cluster headache community is demanding treatment in ways that they finally now have a study happening in Connecticut that's underway. And, you know, these are communities that you don't hear about cluster headaches. I didn't even know about them until I met these individuals. And they're not into psychedelics. They just don't want to feel this chronic, terrible pain all the time. And so I think it is starting to shift, right? It's not just top down anymore. The communities are asking.
Creative research, that was community-driven research. The Cluster Buster Headache study was reaching out to the community and what are you guys using psilocybin? They got so much data that it was publishable. They didn't run it in a clinic, they didn't run it anywhere, but they used the internet to draw this database.
one piece I can speak about the MDMA work is that MAPS is a nonprofit pharmaceutical company. So we are doing this work for social benefit, not for profit. And so the goal is to get MDMA approved for medicalization for PTSD by 2021. And MAPS last year developed the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation to help, once it's legal, for us to establish a system of clinics where we'll train therapists in the particular MAPS model. But it will always remain generic. So MDMA is never going to be patented. It's a generic drug. It used to be on patent by Merck in '62. It was first on patent, and then that patent expired. So that's a really good thing that it's not patented, because that means that we can keep it more affordable and more accessible to more populations.
I don't think there's a patent on either ayahuasca or mushrooms yet.
There have been attempts to patent ayahuasca, but
It turns out you can make it by yourself, so you don't
Yeah.
have to buy it from the lab. So you don't have to talk to those guys at all.
so I tried to
They can't go talk to each
patent
other.
or something.
So I thought I was gonna get a singing bowl exit signal, but I think we've got just a few minutes left. And so I have one final question that no one has been prepared for. But I like to envision the future where I can do everything that my heart desires, that I've seen could benefit people. So very quickly, what would each of you do with $1 million worth of Bitcoin? And if you don't answer, I'm going to give a bunch of answers for myself.
I can go.
Okay.
That's why we're here, by the way.
Also personally or professionally?
Either one, you got to pick.
I would help to establish one of the first MAPS clinics in Boulder, Colorado. And that clinic would be a space that would combine other holistic modalities and other treatments, potentially cannabis treatment, ketamine treatment, and would also be a place, I have a background in wilderness therapy, so a place where people could be in connect with nature and go out in nature with these tools, with the assistance of the healers that work within that clinical setting, and help to establish not just one center, but also work to establish a series of centers. And that is my vision and one of Rick's visions at MAPS too, to create that.
Okay, who's next?
I'll just say that with that kind of investment, I think professionally, I've just started a nonprofit called Source Research Foundation, and the aim of that foundation is really to start changing the trajectory of students who are in school right now who want to be a part of psychedelic research, who don't really have a voice. Maybe they're studying something that is not necessarily in a medical model of research that is very acceptable in the US right now. Not very acceptable, it's more acceptable. And so elevating those voices right now and connecting with students to try to get them into trajectories where they do have a seat at the table, to be at a place in a couple years and in the next 10 years to really guide the shape of this community as it expands outside of the psychedelic community into the Western culture. So I would use it to try to do that.
Awesome.
And a lot of the research with PTSD and various kind of addiction were research topics that started back in like the 50s and 60s and were picked up on, again with the Renaissance. But one of the strands of research that has not been as picked up on has been psychedelics and creativity. And so I'd really love to do a non-medical study with creative writers and artists and musicians and philosophers who they're just there to help us understand these experiences and communicate them in different kinds of modalities, since definitely scientific language is not the only or best even language to describe what's going on in the experiences.
Awesome.
Very good.
All right, you guys what are you doing with $1 million?
You going, Dennis? You want to go last?
You go ahead.
Just real quick, I would create a spiritual healing center probably in Arizona where I am, where we're working with Native Americans and doing this, fulfilling this eagle condor prophecy and bringing ayahuasca healing to the Native American community and the larger community there in the United States. And then also I would put it towards my organization, Modern Spirit, demonstrating the value of spiritual healing and modern healthcare, supporting education programs for professional healthcare workers, letting them know about all this research, all that stuff, doctors, nurses, etc., and some research and some experiences, taking people down there and letting them go through it. Yeah.
Awesome. And Dennis?
Well, I have only $1 million.
Hey, we're starting off, you know,
Bitcoin,
reasonable.
you know, the nouveau riche of the crypto world.
You've offended them. You've offended
10 million
them.
or 100 million,
No
then we
Bitcoin
can
for
get
that.
serious. But anyway, so try to curb my greed here. $1 million would be a good start. And what I see for myself in the long term is I've been working with the center in the Sacred Valley doing retreats and so on. There's a possibility of getting control of it, and I think that my long-term vision is that I want to recreate the first psychedelic academy or mystery school since Eleusis. So the first psychedelically oriented place for learning, exploration of consciousness, therapy, and all of this that's existed in 1,500 years, ever since the gods sacked and burned the temple of Eleusis. We need to recreate that first in South America, where it can happen, and then make it sprout like mushrooms all over the world. So
Thank you, Dennis. As you can see, a lot of us, the vision that we have, even if given so much opportunity, is to give back. We're talking about communities, healing, giving to people who have less than we have, recognizing our privilege. And so I hope that you kind of understand that even though we're scientists and researchers and we're kind of in the mainstream, that a lot of us are here because we have been changed ourselves and see that the only potential for the future is to reduce self-interest and to give to others who have less than we have. And I hope that that inspires you. And I know that there's a lot of potential in this audience to actually make a lot of change happen. So, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.